In the early days of the United States, when the whole country was this fiery, fragile experiment that could have just shattered at any moment, one man's name kept coming up again and again as the guy holding it all together. Today, we're diving into the story of that man, Henry Clay. And hey, don't just take my word for it. Abraham Lincoln himself, the guy who actually saved the Union, called Clay the beau ideal of a statesman, basically the perfect model of what a leader should be. That is some seriously high praise, and we're about to find out exactly why he earned it. You really can't overstate how high the stakes were back then. The young republic was just constantly teetering on the edge. You had rivalries between regions, huge fights over money, and of course the explosive issue of slavery, always threatening to just blow the whole American experiment apart. And time after time, Henry Clay was the one who stepped into that gap. But see, Clay wasn't just some political firefighter, running from one crisis to the next. He had this grand, proactive vision for what America could be. So to really get the man who kept saving the Union, you first have to understand the Union he was trying to build. He called it the American system. Now, this wasn't just some dry, boring economic policy. This was his blueprint for national greatness. Clay pictured a country that was economically independent, powerful, and, this is the key part, interconnected. The whole point was to break free from what he called the British system and create a self-sufficient powerhouse where every part of the country needed the other parts to succeed. Okay, so here's how these three pieces fit together, kind of like a puzzle. First, you've got a protective tariff. It's a tax on imported goods that would help America's brand new factories compete. Then, the money from that tariff would pay for the third piece, internal improvements. We're talking roads, canals, the stuff that would physically connect the industrial north, the farming west, and the cotton-growing south. And what held it all together? A strong national bank, making sure the money was stable. It was this brilliant, self-reinforcing cycle designed to create unity. But that grand vision had one massive, constant, and deadly threat: the bitter, ugly, and growing fight over slavery. So if he was ever going to build his American system, he first had to keep the country from literally breaking apart. And this is where he earns his famous nickname, the Great Compromiser. His entire career was basically a highlight reel of national crises that he managed to diffuse. In 1820, he gets the Missouri Compromise done, balancing the number of slave and free states, and, kicking the can down the road. Then in 1833, South Carolina threatens to just up and leave the Union over a tariff. Who fixes it? Clay, with another compromise. And in 1850, as an old man, he comes back for one last-ditch effort. For decades, he was the guy walking the tightrope, trying to keep everyone from falling off. All right, so you absolutely cannot talk about Henry Clay without talking about his arch-nemesis, Andrew Jackson. Their rivalry wasn't just personal, though it was very personal. It was this titanic clash of ideas that basically defined an entire era of American politics. We're talking two giants with two completely different visions for the country's soul. And it all kicked off with one of the wildest elections in U.S. history. In 1824, nobody won a majority, so the whole thing gets thrown to the House of Representatives. Clay, who came in fourth, was out. But as Speaker of the House, he was the kingmaker. He put his support behind John Quincy Adams. Adams wins, and then Adams immediately names Clay his Secretary of State, which back then was like the express lane to the presidency. Jackson's camp just exploded, screaming, "Corrupt bargain!" And that lit a fire that burned between them for the rest of their lives. I mean, their differences just couldn't have been more clear. You have Clay, the ultimate dealmaker, who believed Congress should lead and that the American system would unify the country. He built the Whig Party on that idea. Then you have Jackson, the populist general, a Democrat, who was all about states' rights and a super powerful president. He absolutely despised Clay's national bank. They were total political opposites. And if you think I'm exaggerating how personal this was, get a load of this. Years later, on his deathbed, someone asked Andrew Jackson if he had any regrets. He said he had two, and one of them was that he had not shot Henry Clay. Wow, that's how deep the hatred ran between these two. So, this brings us to Clay's final years. You have to picture him as this aging lion. His health is failing, and he's coming out of retirement for one last, absolutely desperate fight to save the Union he'd spent his whole life trying to hold together. Okay, the year is 1850. The U.S. just won the Mexican-American War, a war Clay had been against, by the way, and now it has all this new land. And with that land comes that toxic, impossible question: Will these new territories allow slavery or not? The country is right back at the breaking point. And so a frail Henry Clay, sick with tuberculosis, is called back to the Senate to try and work his magic one last time. But the world had changed. A new, more radical generation of politicians was taking over. Guys like William Seward from New York, they looked at Clay's life's work, the art of compromise, and they called it, and I'm quoting here, radically wrong and essentially vicious. For them, compromising on slavery wasn't smart politics. It was a moral sin. The middle ground that Clay had lived on his entire career was just vanishing. Clay poured every last bit of his energy into creating this massive plan, the Compromise of 1850. But it failed. He was just too weak, and the country was too divided. In the end, it took a younger senator, Stephen Douglas, to take Clay's plan, break it up into a bunch of separate bills, and force them through Congress one by one. So the compromise passed, but the way it passed was a really bad sign. The era of grand national compromise was pretty much over. Clay died in 1852, just 2 years later, and after he was gone, the nation just started to spiral. Without its great compromiser, the center just fell apart. And that leads us to the great unanswered question of his legacy. He ran for president 3 different times and lost every time. But what if he'd won? I mean, just think about it. How might American history be completely, totally, unrecognizably different? Let's just play this out for a second. If Clay beats Jackson in 32, there's no bank war. Maybe the massive economic depression of 1837 doesn't happen. Or what if he wins in 44? He was against annexing Texas. That means the Mexican-American War might never happen, which means the U.S. doesn't get all that new territory that caused so much fighting. The whole path to the Civil War could have been completely different. It's a wild thing to think about. But he didn't win. And when he was gone, that whole idea of compromise that he represented just seemed to vanish from American politics. Just 9 years after he died, the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. The Union he had spent 50 years fighting to preserve was engulfed in the flames of the Civil War. And yet, his influence didn't just disappear. The man who would finally save the nation, Abraham Lincoln, was a huge follower of Clay. Lincoln basically built his own political philosophy on Clay's ideas of keeping the Union together, once saying, "I can express all my views on the slavery question by quotations from Henry Clay." In a way, Clay's legacy became the intellectual foundation for the man who would finish his work. Which leaves us with this one last, kind of haunting question. Once that new generation took power, the one that saw compromise not as a good thing, but as a vicious act of weakness, was the Civil War just bound to happen? Was Henry Clay not just a great leader, but maybe the last thing standing between the United States and its own self-destruction? It's something to think about.